I just wanted a quiet home for my daughter. Then the HOA president decided I didn't belong there. She sent hired security to my driveway twice. The accusations got wilder with every single week. I stood in my own yard, shaking, humiliated, alone. Months later, everything I thought I knew flipped. The woman calling me a threat had a secret. What happened next made the whole neighborhood watch in silence. My name is Simone Carter, 36 years old, married to Marcus, mother to 7-year-old Zoe. We'd worked for years to afford Willowbrook Estates, a gated community outside Atlanta with manicured lawns and a strict homeowners association. I was a civil rights attorney. Though I rarely mentioned it, I wanted neighbors, not clients, not enemies, not attention. We moved in on a warm April Saturday, the moving truck idling while Zoe chased fireflies on the new lawn. Marcus squeezed my hand and said this was the fresh start we'd earned. I believed him completely. I had no idea a woman 3 houses down was already writing notes about us before we'd even unpacked the boxes. Debbie Holt introduced herself the very next morning, clipboard in hand, before we'd even found the coffee maker. She smiled with her mouth but not her eyes, said she was HOA president, and handed us a thick binder of community standards. I thanked her, thinking she was simply thorough. I didn't yet understand thorough was her weapon. Willowbrook's rules were exhausting. Approved mailbox colors, curtain requirements, lawn ornament restrictions, even guidelines for holiday lights. Debbie had chaired the board for 9 years, unopposed, because most neighbors found her exhausting to fight. People joked about her behind closed doors but never to her face. I assumed the jokes were exaggerated. Within 2 weeks, Debbie began appearing whenever I was outside, watering plants, walking Zoe to the bus stop, unloading groceries. She'd comment on our landscaping choices, ask pointed questions about how we could afford the neighborhood, and mention how different our household felt from the rest of the street. Marcus laughed it off as small-town nosiness. I wasn't so sure. People who used politeness as a leash, and Debbie's compliments always came wrapped around a warning. Still, I told myself to give her the benefit of the doubt. New neighborhood, new rules, new chance to belong. The first written notice arrived in June. Our porch swing violated approved outdoor furniture guidelines. No other house on the block had received a similar notice, though 3 had matching swings. I photographed the neighbors' porches, filed it away quietly, and complied anyway. I wanted peace more than I wanted to be right. Debbie began referring to me as that new family in community emails, never by name, while other new arrivals were welcomed personally with casserole deliveries and Facebook shoutouts. Small omissions, easy to dismiss individually. Together, they formed a pattern I recognized instantly, one I'd spent my whole career fighting in courtrooms. At the July block party, Debbie steered conversations away whenever I approached, then loudly praised families who've been part of Willowbrook's fabric for generations. Marcus noticed too. Finally, he squeezed my shoulder and murmured that maybe we should just keep our heads down. I nodded, but something in me had already started keeping records. Zoe came home from a neighborhood pool day upset. Debbie's granddaughter told her the pool was for members who really live here. Zoe didn't understand what that meant. I did. Office calmly. Asked for clarification on membership rules. and received a response so evasive it confirmed everything I feared. I began saving emails, timestamps, screenshots of the community Facebook group where Debbie moderated comments selectively, deleting anything questioning her decisions. I wasn't building a legal case yet, not consciously. But 20 years of professional instinct doesn't switch off just because you're standing in your own kitchen instead of an office. By August, Debbie's notices arrived weekly: grass length, trash can placement, a wind chime deemed excessive noise. Each violation carried a fine. Each fine arrived faster than any other homeowner's. According to the neighbor across the street who'd lived there 12 years and had never once been fined for anything similar. That neighbor, an older white woman named Carol, started leaving cookies on our porch with little notes. "Don't let her get to you." Carol never said more, but her eyes said everything. She'd clearly watched this pattern play out before, with someone else, in some earlier version of this exact same story. I asked Carol directly one afternoon what she meant. She hesitated, glanced toward Debbie's house, then quietly mentioned a Vietnamese family who'd left Willowbrook 2 years earlier under pressure, and a young Latino couple before them. Carol wouldn't elaborate further. She just squeezed my hand and walked back to her garden. I started documenting more deliberately after that conversation. Dates, dollar amounts, comparison photos of identical violations, left unfined on other properties. Marcus thought I was being paranoid. I told him paranoid people don't have 3 years of case law memorized about disparate enforcement of neighborhood ordinances. He stopped arguing after that. September brought the annual HOA meeting. Held in the clubhouse Debbie decorated like her personal throne room. She ran the meeting with practiced authority, silencing dissent with parliamentary technicalities only she seemed to fully understand. I watched, took notes, and realized this wasn't a homeowners association. It was a fiefdom. The spark came over something absurdly small. A bright yellow flag Zoe made for a school project, taped to our mailbox for Support Your School Week. Debbie called it an unauthorized signage violation and demanded its immediate removal, citing a rule that, conveniently, exempted seasonal and school-sponsored displays for everyone else. I removed the flag before Zoe woke up so she wouldn't see it gone. Then I called the HOA office and asked, on record, to see the exemption policy in writing. The woman on the phone stammered, put me on hold twice, and finally admitted no such written exemption policy officially existed. Debbie showed up at my door that evening, uninvited, insisting she was simply protecting property values. I asked her calmly why 3 other school flags on the street remained untouched. She said those families understood the spirit of the rules. I asked what spirit that was. She didn't have an answer ready. That night I filed my first formal written complaint with the HOA board, citing selective enforcement and requesting a review of Debbie's discretionary fining pattern. I copied every board member, attached my documentation, and kept my language professional. I wasn't trying to start a war. I was trying to draw a line. Debbie responded not to me, but to the entire neighborhood email list, framing my complaint as an attack on the values that keep Willowbrook special. She never named me, but everyone knew. Neighbors I'd never spoken to began avoiding eye contact at the mailboxes. Small towns transplant themselves into gated communities faster than people admit. Marcus wanted to drop it, worried about our reputation, worried about Zoe's friendships, Worried in the exhausted way Black fathers learn to worry about battles their families didn't start. I understood his fear completely. I also understood that silence had never once made a Debbie Holt stop. It only fed her. I requested the HOA's fining records under our bylaws transparency clause, a right every homeowner technically possessed but almost nobody ever exercised. Debbie stalled for 2 weeks, citing administrative delays. When the records finally arrived, half were redacted, and the redactions, oddly, only covered fines issued to families who'd left the community. I mentioned the redactions to the board treasurer, a soft-spoken man named Arthur who'd served for 6 years without much visibility. He went pale, glanced toward Debbie's house through his window, and told me he'd always had questions about the association's finances but never felt safe raising them. I filed that away too. 2 nights later, someone slashed one of our porch cushions and left it torn on the front steps. No note, no witnesses, nothing the police could act on. I didn't accuse anyone directly. I simply installed a doorbell camera, quietly, and told Marcus we'd document everything from now on. No exceptions. Debbie, unprompted, brought over a casserole the following morning, expressing shock about the vandalism she'd heard about, though I told no one but Marcus and Carol. Her knowledge of an unreported incident sat in my stomach like a stone. I thanked her for the casserole and said nothing else at all. The camera caught nothing conclusive that week, but it caught something else valuable. Debbie's landscaper trimming hedges on her property that extended 6 feet past the HOA's own setback rules. Rules she'd fined 3 other families for violating by less than a foot. I saved the footage. At Zoe's soccer game that Saturday, another mother pulled me aside, whispering that her family had also received sudden fines after her husband, at a barbecue, questioned Debbie's decision to award the landscaping contract to her brother-in-law's company. The mother looked terrified just discussing it. I thanked her and promised discretion. I began quietly compiling names, 5 families, then 7, then 9, all reporting eerily similar patterns. Selective fines, sudden hostility after minor disagreements, and financial questions nobody dared ask aloud. Pattern isn't proof, but a pattern is a map, and I'd spent my career learning how to read maps like this. Debbie escalated by requesting a special compliance inspection of our property, citing anonymous complaints she refused to specify. 2 board members I didn't recognize arrived unannounced, walked our yard with clipboards, and left without finding a single actual violation. The visit itself, I realized, wasn't about compliance. It was a message. I sent a certified letter to the full board requesting the anonymous complaints in writing, per bylaw requirements. Debbie replied that such requests undermine the integrity of the reporting system. I replied that a reporting system with no accountability wasn't integrity. It was intimidation, and I'd be documenting every response for my own records. Marcus finally stopped asking me to let things go. He'd seen the torn cushion, the redacted documents, the landscaper footage, and something in him shifted from fear to quiet fury. "You're the lawyer," he said one night. "Just don't let her know that yet." I hadn't planned to. Not until it mattered. By late September, I understood clearly what I was dealing with. Not a difficult neighbor, but a small, unaccountable power structure built entirely around one woman's need for control. I wasn't angry yet. Not really. I was simply, carefully, building the case Debbie Holt didn't know she was already starring in. October began with Debbie announcing a new neighborhood safety initiative at the general meeting, funded by a modest increase in HOA dues. She introduced a private security contractor, Redline Patrol, who would drive through Willowbrook nightly. Nobody objected. Driveway that patrol car would circle most often. Within the first week, the Redline Patrol car parked outside our house 4 separate nights. Engine running, spotlight occasionally sweeping our windows. I called the contracted number to ask why. The dispatcher said patrols followed resident-flagged addresses of interest, a designation Debbie, as HOA liaison, controlled entirely on her own discretion. I confronted Debbie at the mailboxes, asking directly why our address had been flagged. She smiled and said safety concerns had been raised anonymously about unfamiliar vehicles near our home. Vehicles that turned out to be Marcus's own car, parked exactly where it always parked, in our own driveway, every single night. The security guard assigned most often was a heavy-set man named Gary Wexler, mid-50s, ex-police, who'd left his department under circumstances he never discussed. He began knocking on our door under vague pretexts, checking on reported noise, verifying vehicle registration, questions that had nothing to do with actual safety protocols. Zoe started asking why the security man kept parking outside her window at night. I told her he was just doing his job, though my hands shook slightly folding her laundry as I said it. Marcus began sleeping lighter, listening for engines idling outside, a vigilance no father should have to maintain at home. I filed a formal complaint against the targeted patrolling with the HOA board and, separately, with Redline Patrol's corporate office, citing discriminatory deployment of private security. Redline's regional manager called me back within 2 days, oddly apologetic, promising to review dispatch logs. Debbie found out about that call within hours. That weekend, Gary Wexler stopped Marcus in our own driveway, demanding identification per HOA request, despite Marcus standing beside his own car, in front of our own garage. Marcus, calm as ever, asked to see the specific complaint authorizing the stop. Gary couldn't produce one.
He simply repeated.
I arrived home mid-confrontation and recorded the final 2 minutes on my phone, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. Gary noticed the camera and backed off immediately, muttering something about just doing his rounds. The footage, calm as it looked, made my stomach turn for hours afterward. I posted nothing publicly yet. Instead, I sent the video, formally, to the HOA board, Redline Patrol, and, for the first time, to a colleague at my firm who specialized in housing discrimination. Her response was immediate. Simone, this is exactly the pattern I litigate. Document everything. Don't confront her alone again. Debbie's response to my complaint arrived 3 days later, framing the driveway stop as standard security verification, applied equally to all residents. I requested comparable footage or logs showing similar stops at other homes. None existed. 9 years of Redline's contract. Ours was the only address stopped that month. Word spread through the neighborhood Facebook group anyway. Filtered through Debbie's narrative first, certain residents are making baseless accusations against our dedicated security team. Comments piled up defending Gary, defending Debbie, questioning why some people always seem to have issues nobody else experienced. I watched the pile on with a strange, cold clarity. Carol messaged me privately, furious on my behalf, saying she'd seen the same script play out with the Nguyen family 2 years earlier: sudden security attention, community rumors, isolation, until they finally sold at a loss and left. "She wears people down," Carol wrote. "That's always been her method. Wearing people down." I began reaching out quietly to former residents Carol mentioned. The Nguyen family, now living 40 minutes away, responded to my email within a day, relieved someone finally believed them. They shared old emails, old fines, old security logs eerily identical to mine. The pattern wasn't paranoia. It was documented, repeatable, and deliberate. Meanwhile, Arthur the treasurer reached out again, this time in person, meeting me at a coffee shop outside the neighborhood, visibly nervous. He confirmed the security contract's budget had tripled since Debbie took over dispatch authority. Yet actual patrol hours across the whole community had barely increased. Someone was profiting from something. Arthur wouldn't name names outright, but he slid a printed budget summary across the table, tapping one line item twice: community enhancement consulting fee, paid monthly to an LLC he didn't recognize. I photographed the document, thanked him, and drove home, turning that phrase over and over in my mind. A quick corporate records search that night revealed the LLC's registered agent shared a last name with Debbie's maiden name. Wexler Holt Consulting, formed 18 months prior, receiving $4,000 monthly from HOA dues for services no board minutes ever described in any detail whatsoever. I sat back, stunned, and smiled grimly. I didn't confront Debbie with this yet. Evidence without strategy is just noise. And I'd learned long ago that revealing your hand too early only teaches your opponent to hide better. Instead, I kept building financial records, patrol logs, witness statements, quietly, patiently, the way I'd built every winning case before. Gary Wexler's visits continued, though slightly less frequent after my complaint, replaced instead by anonymous notices, unapproved holiday decorations, a trash bin left out 4 hours past pickup, a unauthorized garden gnome Zoe had picked out herself at a school fundraiser. Each fine, small, deniable, individually forgettable, collectively suffocating. Zoe's teacher called about a change in her behavior, quieter at school, reluctant to discuss home. My daughter had absorbed more of this tension than I'd realized, despite our efforts to shield her. That call broke something loose in me. This had stopped being about mailboxes or fences. This was about my child. Marcus and I discussed moving that night. Seriously, for the first time. We'd worked too hard for this house to abandon it over one woman's cruelty. But no house was worth Zoe's peace. I told him to give me 1 more month. I needed time to finish what I'd already started building. I formally requested, in writing, full HOA financial disclosure under our state's association transparency statute, a legal right rarely invoked but absolutely enforceable. Debbie's response took 9 days and arrived full of procedural objections. I recognized delay tactics instantly. I'd used them myself, professionally, against opponents with far more to hide. The board scheduled an emergency closed session to discuss my disruptive requests. I wasn't invited, despite being the requesting homeowner. A clear bylaw violation I documented immediately. Arthur, bless him, texted me a partial summary afterward. Debbie had proposed a rule change specifically targeting repeated transparency requests as finable harassment. That proposed rule, aimed squarely at silencing me, backfired the moment I forwarded it, along with everything else, to the state's HOA Regulatory Ombudsman Office. 2 weeks later, Willowbrook received an official inquiry letter requesting documentation of its fining practices and security deployment records. Debbie's tone in emails changed almost overnight. She grew sweeter, publicly, inviting me to coffee, praising Zoe's school achievements in the community newsletter, complimenting our beautifully maintained lawn after months of citations. I recognized the shift instantly. Cornered animals often turn charming right before they turn dangerous. I accepted the coffee invitation anyway. I wanted to watch her closely. Over coffee, Debbie tried a new angle, framing herself as overwhelmed, misunderstood, simply protecting the community she loved from unspecified threats. She never apologized for anything specific. She apologized generally, vaguely, the way people do when they want forgiveness without admitting to any particular crime worth forgiving in the first place. I asked her directly, calmly, about Wexler Holt Consulting. Her face didn't move, but her coffee cup did, clattering slightly against the saucer. She said it was a family friend's small business, nothing more. I said I'd love to see the contracted services in writing sometime. She changed the subject immediately, smoothly, practiced. That night, someone reported our above-ground trampoline as an unpermitted structure, despite it being installed 8 months earlier with, ironically, Debbie's own written approval buried in an old email thread. I forwarded her own approval back to the board within the hour. The fine was quietly dropped. The pattern was not. Redline Patrol's regional manager called again, this time confidentially, admitting off the record that Debbie had specifically requested increased patrols near the new family on Magnolia Court since the contract began, citing no incident reports, no complaints filed through proper channels, nothing but her own personal, unilateral, unaccountable authorization. I asked if he'd put that admission in writing. He hesitated, then said corporate would likely prefer he didn't, but he'd testify if it ever came to that. I thanked him, hung up, and added his name to a growing list of people quietly willing to speak the truth when finally asked directly. November brought Willowbrook's holiday decoration contest, an event Debbie controlled entirely, judging her own neighbors' homes with a scoring rubric nobody had ever actually seen in writing. Our lights, thoughtfully arranged, scored suspiciously low, while Debbie's own house, decorated nearly identically, somehow scored perfect marks across every single category listed. Zoe, watching the results posted online, asked quietly why our house never won anything, even when it looked pretty. I didn't have a gentle answer that wouldn't also be a lie. I told her some people make rules that aren't fair, and that we were learning how to fix that, together, as a family. I began preparing a formal packet for the state ombudsman. Financial irregularities, discriminatory patrol logs, witness statements from 4 former and current residents, and documented selective enforcement spanning 11 months. My colleague at the firm offered to review it pro bono, calling it one of the cleanest disparate enforcement cases she'd seen in years. Debbie, unaware how much I'd already assembled, escalated further, proposing at the December board meeting a new community character clause requiring board approval for any homeowner hosting gatherings over 8 people, a rule aimed transparently at Marcus's family reunion, planned for months, already on every calendar in our extended family. I stood at that meeting for the first time and spoke publicly against the proposal, citing selective application and lack of legitimate safety rationale. Several neighbors, emboldened by my willingness to speak, voiced their own long-buried complaints. Debbie's confident composure cracked slightly, visibly, for the first time since we'd moved in. She adjourned the meeting early, citing time constraints before a vote could occur. Walking to our cars afterward, 3 separate families approached me quietly, thanking me, sharing their own stories, asking what could actually be done. I told them the truth, documentation, patience, and eventually, accountability nobody could keep avoiding forever. That night, Gary Wexler's patrol car sat outside our house for nearly 3 hours, longer than ever before, spotlight repeatedly sweeping our bedroom window. I recorded the entire duration on my doorbell camera. Time-stamped, unedited, undeniable. I didn't confront him. I simply saved the footage alongside everything else I'd been collecting. Marcus, watching the footage with me afterward, went quiet in a way that scared me more than any argument could have. "This isn't about mailboxes anymore," he said finally. "This is about control. About her deciding we don't belong here, and using every tool she has to prove herself right." I agreed, and told him what I hadn't yet said aloud. I was preparing to file a formal fair housing complaint, backed by everything we'd gathered, alongside the transparency violations already under state review. This wasn't just self-defense anymore. This was the exact kind of case I'd built my entire career around. Marcus asked if I was scared. I told him the truth, not of Debbie, not anymore, but of how long this could take, how much it might cost us emotionally before any justice arrived. He took my hand and said whatever it cost, we'd pay it together, as a family, refusing to be pushed out. By the second week of December, I had a complete complaint package ready to file, financial evidence pointing toward possible embezzlement, discriminatory security deployment documented in writing, and 8 neighbors willing to corroborate a years-long pattern. I hadn't shown my full hand yet. I was simply waiting for the right moment to reveal it. The ombudsman inquiry, once opened, seemed to genuinely rattle Debbie. Patrols near our house stopped entirely for nearly 3 weeks. No new fines arrived. The Facebook group grew unusually quiet. Comments disabled on several old posts I'd flagged. For the first time in months, our house felt like simply, quietly, ours again. Zoe's teacher reported improvement almost immediately. More talkative, more herself, drawing pictures of our house with a bright sun instead of the gray skies she'd been sketching for weeks. Marcus and I allowed ourselves, cautiously, to exhale. We decorated the tree together, laughed more, let the tension in our shoulders finally loosen. Carol invited us over for a proper dinner. The first time we'd been inside another Willowbrook home besides our own. She showed us old newsletters from before Debbie's presidency. A community that once sounded warm, flexible, genuinely neighborly. "It wasn't always like this," Carol said softly. "She changed it. Slowly. Piece by piece." I asked Carol why nobody had challenged Debbie sooner. In 9 years of unopposed leadership. Carol admitted, honestly, that fear had simply won. Year after year, fear of fines, fear of isolation, fear of becoming the next family quietly pressured into selling and moving away without ever understanding fully why. I told Carol what I'd been building, cautiously, trusting her with details I hadn't shared with anyone outside Marcus and my colleague. Carol's eyes filled with tears. "Someone finally has the tools to actually stop her," she said. I didn't correct her hopeful phrasing, though privately, I knew tools alone rarely won anything. The HOA scheduled its annual election for late January. Board seats and the presidency itself technically up for renewal, though Debbie had run unopposed every single year since taking office. Arthur mentioned, quietly, that several residents were finally discussing challenging her, emboldened by the transparency requests and the ongoing state inquiry. I considered running myself, briefly, before deciding my case needed to remain untangled from any appearance of personal political ambition. Instead, I encouraged Arthur to run for president, offering quiet strategic advice, understanding that credibility mattered more coming from someone who'd served faithfully beside Debbie rather than openly against her. Christmas arrived gently that year, our first genuinely peaceful holiday since moving to Willowbrook. Zoe's grandparents visited. The reunion gathering happened without incident despite Debbie's earlier attempted restrictions, and for 2 full weeks, I almost let myself believe the worst chapter of this story had already quietly ended. I should have known better. During quiet periods, she strategized, privately with 2 loyal board members, discussing election preparations nobody else was invited to attend. I recognized the pattern instantly, not retreat, but reloading, patiently, for whatever confrontation came next. In early January, Redline Patrol's regional manager called with unsettling news. Debbie had requested his company prepare additional security presence for the upcoming annual community meeting and election, citing vague safety concerns about outside agitators potentially disrupting Willowbrook's process. I asked who, specifically, she considered an outside agitator. He didn't answer. I didn't need him to answer. I already knew. Not for a peaceful election, but for a performance, one designed to frame legitimate dissent as dangerous, to justify security intervention against residents daring to challenge her, and specifically, unmistakably, to justify it against me. I finalized my complaint packet that week, timing its submission deliberately for after the annual meeting, wanting whatever unfolded there documented alongside everything else. My colleague reviewed the final draft, calling it airtight, and reminded me that airtight cases still required patience, timing, and the discipline not to strike too early. Marcus grew nervous again as January progressed, sensing the calm was ending. I reassured him honestly, whatever Debbie planned, we were prepared for it now in ways we hadn't been in April. We had documentation, witnesses, legal standing, and 8 months of patience she'd never once suspected we were quietly spending wisely. The night before the annual meeting, I laid out every document one final time across our kitchen table, financial records, patrol logs, witness statements, video footage, and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite peace, but was close enough. Tomorrow, Debbie Holt would finally meet the neighbor she'd underestimated completely. The clubhouse overflowed that January evening. More residents present than I'd ever seen at a single Willowbrook meeting. Word had spread, quietly, through channels Debbie didn't control, group texts, driveway conversations, Carol's careful outreach. People arrived not for holiday cookies this time, but for something they finally sensed was coming. Debbie opened the meeting with practiced warmth, thanking everyone for their continued trust, gesturing toward two uniformed Red Line guards stationed near the exits, explaining their presence as precaution against recent tensions in the community. Several neighbors exchanged glances. Nobody had reported any tension requiring armed security at a homeowners meeting. Arthur stood when nominations opened, announcing his candidacy for HOA president, voice shaking slightly but steady enough to carry across the room. Debbie's smile didn't waver, though her knuckles whitened around her clipboard. She thanked Arthur for his years of loyal service, in a tone that sounded almost like a threat. I hadn't planned to speak, wanting to preserve my complaint's integrity. But when Debbie opened floor comments and immediately called on three supporters first, skipping raised hands from families she recognized as dissenters, something in the room's unfairness became too obvious to ignore. I raised my hand and waited, deliberately, silently. She finally called on me, almost daring me forward. I kept my voice measured, factual, asking simply why the security budget had tripled while patrol coverage remained flat, and whether the board could confirm no financial relationship existed between HOA vendors and current leadership. The room went completely, utterly silent. Debbie's composure cracked visibly for the first time in 9 months. She accused me of spreading baseless rumors and harassing this board with repeated frivolous requests. I calmly noted, on record, that a state ombudsman inquiry was already underway examining exactly these questions. Several neighbors audibly gasped. Arthur looked, briefly, terrified. That was when Debbie signaled the guards. Gary Wexler approached me directly, informing me I was disrupting the meeting and needed to step outside immediately. I asked, calmly, under what specific authority he was ordering a homeowner to leave a scheduled association meeting she had every legal right to attend and speak at. He didn't have an answer, only repeated that Debbie had requested it, reaching toward my arm as though physically escorting me out. I stepped back, steady, and said clearly, loudly enough for the recording several neighbors had already started, that he did not have my consent to touch me, under any circumstance. The room erupted, some gasping, some recording, one man standing to physically block Gary's path toward me entirely. Debbie shouted for order, her voice cracking, while Arthur, finally finding his own courage, declared the meeting improperly conducted and demanded the guards stand down immediately or he'd call actual police himself. Gary backed off, uncertain now without Debbie's clear directive, glancing between us like a man realizing, perhaps for the first time, that following orders without questioning them might carry real consequences. I stood my ground, unmoving, while roughly 40 neighbors watched a moment none of them would forget for a very long time. Debbie, cornered, tried a different tactic entirely, announcing loudly that she felt physically threatened, and would be filing a police report against me for aggressive behavior at the meeting. I almost laughed. I simply said I welcomed any investigation, and that I had extensive documentation of my own to provide. The meeting adjourned in chaos shortly after, Debbie storming toward her car while Gary trailed behind, still visibly rattled. Neighbors surrounded me instead, not with hostility, but with something closer to relief, as though someone had finally said aloud what everyone had quietly known but never dared to speak first. Carol hugged me tightly outside, whispering that she hadn't seen anyone stand up to Debbie like that in all her years in Willowbrook. Arthur thanked me too, though nervously, worried aloud about what retaliation might follow. I told him honestly that retaliation was exactly what I'd already spent 8 months preparing for. Debbie did file that police report the following morning, describing me as aggressive and threatening during the meeting. 2 officers arrived at our home that afternoon, polite but thorough, asking for my account. I provided it calmly, along with video from 3 separate neighbors' phones showing exactly what had actually happened. The officers reviewed the footage together, exchanged a look I recognized instantly from years of courtroom work, and told me, honestly, that no charges would be pursued given the clear evidence. One officer, quietly, on his way out, mentioned this wasn't the first complaint they'd received about Willowbrook's HOA leadership. That comment stayed with me for days. I reached out through official channels and confirmed, eventually, that the local precinct had fielded at least 6 prior noise or disturbance complaints. From Debbie's address over the years, several involving disputes with contractors, delivery drivers, and, notably, 2 previous Redline security employees. I requested Gary Wexler's professional background through public records, curious now about his prior police career. What I found stopped me cold. He'd left his previous department 11 years earlier following a formal complaint of excessive force against a black teenager during a routine traffic stop, never fully adjudicated, quietly resolved through resignation. I sat with that information for a long time before deciding how to use it. This wasn't just about one HOA president's cruelty anymore. Debbie had specifically, knowingly, deployed a man with a documented history of racially charged excessive force against exactly the kind of family she'd been targeting from the very beginning. I added the finding to my complaint packet, alongside everything else, and reached out to a local investigative journalist who'd previously covered HOA overreach stories in the Atlanta area. She responded within hours, deeply interested, asking to see documentation before committing to anything, exactly the professional caution I'd hoped for and expected. Meanwhile, the neighborhood shifted visibly in the days following the meeting. Families who'd stayed silent for years suddenly found their voices, sharing stories in a private group chat Carol organized, deliberately outside Debbie's moderation reach. 9 separate households, turned out, had experienced strikingly similar patterns of targeted enforcement. Debbie, sensing the tide turning, attempted damage control, hosting an impromptu community coffee, defending her leadership record, emphasizing safety and property values she claimed only she could protect. Attendance was noticeably thin. The neighbors who did attend asked pointed questions she visibly struggled, for the first time, to answer smoothly. I learned through Arthur that Debbie's husband, Richard, a quiet man rarely seen outside their home, had begun expressing his own doubts privately, embarrassed by the public. spectacle at the meeting and troubled by questions from his own workplace colleagues, who'd somehow already heard about the confrontation through community grapevines and gossip. Richard approached me directly, unexpectedly, at the grocery store the following week, apologizing quietly for whatever's been happening, admitting he'd stopped asking Debbie about HOA business years ago because she gets so defensive. His discomfort felt genuine. I thanked him for saying anything at all and left it there, deliberately, carefully. That small interaction told me something important. Debbie's control extended even into her own home. Her own marriage built around avoiding confrontation with her rather than genuine partnership. Whatever drove her need for absolute authority ran deeper than simple neighborhood politics. I filed that observation away too, though not for any legal purpose. The state ombudsman's office, meanwhile, formally requested Willowbrook's complete financial records for the past 3 fiscal years, citing credible indications of irregular vendor relationships. Debbie had 30 days to comply. Arthur reported she'd hired an attorney of her own, though he wouldn't confirm rumors about how the association was funding that cost. I suspected, correctly it turned out later, that Debbie was using HOA funds to pay her personal legal defense, another violation entirely separate from the original financial questions raised. I documented every rumor carefully, understanding the difference between what I could prove and what I merely suspected, a distinction that mattered enormously in court. Gary Wexler stopped patrolling our street entirely after the meeting incident, replaced by a different, notably more professional Red Line employee who introduced himself politely and confirmed, off the record, that management had some serious internal conversations following what he called the video everyone at the office had apparently already seen. The video, turned out, had spread beyond our immediate neighborhood entirely. Someone had posted a clip to a local community forum, then to social media more broadly, captioned simply, HOA President's 6th security guard on black homeowner for asking financial questions. Within days, it had thousands of views and growing. I hadn't posted it myself, uncertain even now who had, though I suspected one of the neighbors who'd recorded it that night. Comments filled with outrage, some recognizing Willowbrook by name, others sharing their own similar HOA horror stories. Debbie's carefully curated public image was slipping entirely outside her control now. Debbie responded publicly for the first time, posting a lengthy statement to the community Facebook group insisting the video was taken out of context, and that she'd always treated every resident equally, regardless of background. The comments underneath disagreed almost unanimously, several tagging former Willowbrook residents who confirmed similar treatment years earlier. The investigative journalist I'd contacted reached out again, now actively pursuing the story, having independently verified several elements through public records and interviews with former residents I hadn't even mentioned to her myself. She asked for an on-record interview. I agreed, cautiously, understanding this would change everything once it published. Marcus worried aloud about the exposure, about strangers knowing our business, about Zoe potentially facing questions at school. I understood his fear completely and shared it honestly, but reminded him that silence had never protected our family from Debbie. Visibility, uncomfortable as it felt, might finally be the thing that actually did. I gave the interview carefully, factually, avoiding speculation, sticking strictly to documented events and verified records. I mentioned nothing yet about Gary's background or the LLC payments, wanting those specific findings reserved for formal legal proceedings rather than public reporting, where they'd carry far more weight and consequence. The article published 2 weeks later under the headline, "Inside One Georgia HOA's Pattern of Targeting Minority Families."
It quoted 3 other former residents by name, cited my documentation extensively, and included, devastatingly, Redline's own admission that patrol requests had come directly from Debbie, without any legitimate incident reports justifying them.
Willowbrook exploded, figuratively, within hours of publication. Local news picked up the story. A regional television station requested interviews. Debbie's personal Facebook profile, previously public, disappeared entirely by that evening. Richard, I later learned, had begun quietly researching divorce attorneys, exhausted by an unraveling he hadn't caused but couldn't escape. The HOA board, without Debbie's knowledge, convened an emergency session invoking bylaws allowing removal of an officer facing credible allegations of financial misconduct pending investigation. Arthur, now acting president under procedural rules, informed me formally that Debbie had been suspended from all HOA duties, effective immediately, pending full review. Debbie didn't accept the suspension quietly. She showed up at the next scheduled meeting anyway, attempting to preside as though nothing had changed, until 2 board members physically blocked her from the podium, citing the suspension vote on record. Neighbors watched, stunned, as the woman who'd controlled everything finally lost her grip. I attended that meeting too, this time simply as an observer, watching Debbie's carefully constructed authority collapse in real time. She accused the board of conspiracy, accused me specifically of orchestrating a smear campaign, and stormed out when Arthur calmly read the specific bylaw provisions authorizing her removal aloud. Word for word, the state ombudsman's financial investigation, running parallel to everything else, confirmed within weeks what Arthur had suspected all along. Wexler Holt Consulting had received over $70,000 in HOA funds across 18 months for services no board minutes described, no contracts formally authorized, and no deliverables ever documented anywhere. The name Wexler, I realized with a jolt I should have anticipated sooner, wasn't coincidental at all. Gary Wexler, the security guard, was Debbie's cousin, hired not through any legitimate vetting process, but through family connection, funneled HOA money through a shell consulting arrangement neither of them had expected anyone to actually investigate. That revelation reframed everything. Gary's targeted patrols weren't simply following Debbie's biased instructions. He'd been financially incentivized, directly, to maintain whatever justification kept the consulting contract active, meaning every safety concern he'd manufactured about our family had also, quietly, been lining his own pockets alongside hers. I forwarded this discovery immediately to my colleague and the Ombudsman's office. Understanding it transformed the case from simple discriminatory enforcement into something approaching outright fraud and conspiracy. The investigative journalist, tipped off separately by someone on the board, published a follow-up piece within days confirming the family relationship publicly. Debbie's legal troubles multiplied quickly after that. The district attorney's office, alerted by the ombudsman's findings, opened a preliminary inquiry into potential embezzlement and fraud. Redline Patrol terminated their entire Willowbrook contract, citing reputational concerns, and separately confirmed Gary Wexler's employment had been terminated for policy violations left deliberately vague. Richard filed for divorce that same week, his attorney citing irreconcilable differences in filings that carefully avoided any direct reference to the unfolding scandal. Though everyone in Willowbrook understood exactly what had finally broken a marriage that had, by all accounts, been quietly strained for years before any of this began. I felt no satisfaction watching Debbie's personal life collapse. Only a strange, hollow recognition that cruelty this consuming rarely stayed contained to just one target. Whatever had made Debbie need this much control over everyone around her had clearly been eating her own life long before she'd ever noticed us moving in. Marcus, more practical than sentimental, simply asked what came next. I told him honestly, the formal fair housing complaint I'd prepared months earlier, still unfiled, still waiting for exactly this moment, when every piece of evidence had finally aligned into something no court, no board, no community could reasonably dispute anymore. I filed it the following Monday, quietly, professionally, through proper legal channels rather than public spectacle. The complaint detailed 11 months of documented discriminatory enforcement, financial fraud enabling targeted harassment, and a security deployment pattern specifically weaponized against minority families, supported by testimony from 9 current and former Willowbrook residents. Debbie's attorney, I learned through Arthur, advised her to resign entirely from the board rather than face a formal hearing she seemed increasingly unlikely to survive politically or legally. She refused, initially, insisting she'd done nothing wrong, a claim growing harder to sustain with each new piece of evidence surfacing weekly. The community, meanwhile, began healing in small, visible ways. New families who'd stayed cautiously quiet started speaking openly. Carol organized an actual neighborhood potluck, unaffiliated with Debbie's leadership, that drew nearly 60 residents. More genuine warmth in one evening than I'd witnessed across our entire first 10 months in Willowbrook. Zoe, sensing the shift even without fully understanding it, started drawing sons again in every picture, started inviting friends over without hesitation, started asking when we'd host our own barbecue like the other families did. I told her soon, very soon, once the last piece of this whole mess finally settled. But Debbie Holt, even suspended, even facing investigation, even watching her marriage and reputation crumble in real time, wasn't finished yet. Cornered people, I'd learned long ago in courtrooms, rarely surrender quietly. They escalate. Most desperate move was still, unmistakably, still ahead of us. Debbie's first desperate move came through my employer, not our neighborhood. My law firm's ethics hotline received an anonymous complaint alleging I'd used privileged legal knowledge to intimidate a private citizen and fabricated evidence against a homeowners association. The complaint contained details only someone inside Willowbrook could have known. My managing partner called me in immediately, though not accusingly. She'd already recognized the complaint's language mirrored Debbie's public statements almost verbatim. Still, firm policy required a formal review. I spent 3 anxious days providing documentation proving every claim I'd made publicly and privately was factual, sourced, and verifiable. The firm cleared me within the week, finding the complaint baseless and clearly retaliatory. But the experience shook me deeply. Debbie had reached beyond our neighborhood entirely, attempting to destroy my career, my livelihood, the very credibility I'd built over 15 years, simply because she couldn't control the outcome any other way. Marcus wanted to call the police immediately, certain this constituted harassment. I explained, tiredly, that anonymous complaints, however malicious, rarely met the legal threshold for criminal harassment on their own. What we needed instead was proof of who'd actually filed it. Proof I began quietly, methodically working to obtain. I hired a private investigator, someone my firm occasionally used for civil cases, who traced the anonymous complaints' originating IP address back to a public library. 3 miles from Willowbrook, a location Debbie's own Facebook check-ins, still cached online despite her deleted profile, placed her visiting twice that same week. Circumstantial, my investigator warned, but suggestive enough to document. I added it to my growing file, understanding that circumstantial evidence, stacked high enough alongside everything else, eventually became something courts and investigators couldn't reasonably dismiss as mere coincidence, no matter how badly the opposing side wanted them to. Debbie's second attempt came closer to home, more frightening, more personal. An anonymous call to Georgia's child welfare hotline alleged neglect concerns about Zoe, citing fabricated details about our home that bore no resemblance to reality. A caseworker, required by law to investigate any report, arrived at our door unannounced. I've handled difficult cases in my career, watched clients endure devastating circumstances, but nothing prepared me for the specific terror of a stranger walking through my home evaluating whether my daughter was safe, based entirely on lies engineered by a woman whose only real complaint was that we hadn't left quietly. The caseworker, professional and clearly experienced, completed her assessment within an hour, finding absolutely no basis for concern, noting explicitly in her closing report that the referral appeared to lack credible foundation, and recommended no further action. I thanked her through gritted teeth, closed the door, and finally, quietly, broke down completely. Marcus held me for a long time that evening while Zoe slept, unaware how close we'd come to a different, darker outcome had that caseworker been less thorough, less fair. "This isn't a dispute anymore," Marcus said finally, voice hard in a way I'd rarely heard from him. "This is a war," I agreed, and told him plainly what I'd been reluctant to say aloud until now. I intended to pursue every possible legal consequence available, criminal and civil, against Debbie Holt, not merely to protect our family, but because someone this dangerous, this unaccountable, would absolutely do this again, to someone else. Eventually, I filed a formal police report regarding the false CPS complaint, providing the caseworker's own documentation and my investigator's findings pointing toward Debbie as the likely source. Georgia law treats knowingly false abuse reports as a serious offense, and detectives, this time, took the pattern of escalating harassment extremely seriously. Debbie, meanwhile, grew increasingly isolated within Willowbrook itself. The board formally voted to remove her from the presidency entirely, citing the financial investigation's preliminary findings and multiple bylaw violations documented across her tenure. She lost, along with her title, the last remaining shred of institutional power she'd clung to. Gary Wexler, unemployed now, resentful, and by every account financially strained without the consulting income he and Debbie had quietly split for 18 months. Began appearing around Willowbrook again despite no longer holding any official security role. Driving through in his personal vehicle. Parking near our house without explanation. I documented every appearance. Called it in to local police as unauthorized loitering. And reinforced our home's security cameras myself. Marcus installed motion sensor lighting across our entire property. We weren't taking chances anymore. Not after the CPS report. Not after everything that had already happened across nearly a full year. The neighborhood itself split further into visible factions. A small group, mostly older residents loyal to Debbie's original vision of Willowbrook, defended her publicly, insisting the real problem was newcomers changing the character of the community. Everyone understood exactly what that phrase meant, even those too polite to say it aloud. Carol, furious at the lingering defenders, organized a petition demanding Willowbrook's board formally acknowledge and apologize for the documented pattern of discrimination, gathering over 80 signatures within days. A clear majority of the community finally, publicly, siding against the woman who'd ruled them through fear for nearly a decade. The petition made local news again. This time framing the story less around any single incident and more around an entire community reckoning with what it had allowed to happen under its own governance for years. Out of convenience, out of fear, out of simple unwillingness to challenge someone comfortable in power. Debbie, cornered on every front, professionally disgraced, financially under investigation, publicly petitioned against. Her own marriage ending grew visibly erratic in her. Remaining public appearances. Showing up uninvited to board sessions she no longer held authority to attend. Shouting accusations that grew less coherent with each passing week. I began genuinely worrying about what desperation might drive her toward next. My colleague, experienced in cases where powerful people face total exposure, warned me that the most dangerous moment often came right before complete collapse. When someone with nothing left to lose stopped calculating consequences entirely and started acting purely on impulse. That warning proved prophetic on a Saturday afternoon in early March. At Willowbrook's community pool, reopened for the season, crowded with families enjoying unseasonably warm weather. Zoe swam with friends while Marcus and I sat poolside. Finally, genuinely relaxed for what felt like the first time in nearly a year. Debbie arrived unannounced. Uninvited given her suspended membership privileges. With Gary Wexler trailing behind her. Both moving with the deliberate purpose of people who'd planned this confrontation carefully rather than stumbled into it accidentally. Every head at the pool turned as they approached directly, unmistakably, toward exactly where we sat. "You need to leave," Debbie announced loudly, voice carrying across the entire pool deck, addressing me directly rather than the crowd. "This community amenity is for members in good standing, and you and your family have caused nothing but division and lies since the day you arrived here. Uninvited and unwelcome." I stood slowly, deliberately calm, aware every phone at the pool was already rising to record this moment. "I'm a homeowner in good standing," I said clearly. "You're the one currently suspended from association privileges. I'd suggest you and Mr. Wexler leave before I call the police for trespassing myself." Debbie's face contorted with a rage I hadn't seen even at her worst previous moments. She turned to Gary and said, unmistakably, loud enough for everyone present to hear clearly. Remove her. She's threatening residents and disrupting community safety. You still have authority here, don't you? Gary hesitated, visibly uncertain. I don't work security here anymore, he said quietly. The first honest thing I'd heard him say in nearly a year. Debbie's expression shifted instantly, venomous. Then I'm asking you as family, she hissed, low but audible. Handle this. His face changed. He stepped forward anyway. Gary reached out and grabbed my forearm, hard enough to bruise, attempting to pull me toward the pool gate despite holding no legal authority whatsoever to touch me, remove me, or enforce anything at all. I planted my feet, refused to move an inch, and said, clearly, loudly, let go of me. Now. The entire pool deck went silent except for the sound of children's laughter continuing obliviously in the water behind us. Marcus stood immediately, moving toward Gary, but stopped when I raised a hand, steady, controlled, needing him to let me handle this exact moment precisely, deliberately, on my own terms. You have no legal authority to touch me, I said, loud enough for every phone recording to capture clearly. You're not employed as security. You have no HOA authorization. This is assault. And every person here just witnessed it. Gary's grip loosened, uncertainty finally overtaking whatever loyalty had pushed him forward. Debbie, incredibly, doubled down instead of retreating. She's lying. She's manipulative. She's been trying to destroy this community since the day she moved in, she shouted, voice cracking with something closer to hysteria than authority now. Several neighbors, previously silent, finally spoke up, loudly, directly, in my defense. We all just watched him grab her. One father called out. Phone still recording steadily. This isn't about the community, Debbie. This is about you not being able to control her the way you controlled everyone else for years. Murmurs of agreement rippled across the pool deck. Unmistakable, undeniable, overwhelming. I calmly pulled out my own phone and called the police, requesting an officer respond regarding an assault. Stating my location clearly, keeping my voice level despite my pulse hammering audibly in my own ears. Gary, realizing the gravity of what he'd just done, backed away completely, apologizing quietly, repeatedly, uselessly now. Debbie tried once more, grabbing my arm herself this time, insisting I stop making a scene. Her fingers digging in with surprising force for a woman who'd spent months insisting she only ever wanted peace and order within her beloved community. I didn't flinch. Clearly, let go of me. Marcus finally stepped in then, not violently, simply placing himself firmly between us, forcing Debbie to release her grip entirely. You need to step back, he said, voice low and absolutely unwavering. Right now. Worse for you than it already is. Debbie, finally, actually stepped back. Police arrived within 8 minutes, reviewing footage immediately available from no fewer than 6 different bystanders' phones, all showing the same unmistakable sequence. Gary grabbing my arm without authority, Debbie escalating verbally and then physically herself, and my own consistent, calm, unwavering refusal to be moved. silenced, or intimidated. Officers separated everyone, took statements individually, and informed Debbie and Gary both, clearly, that the footage supported charges of assault and potentially trespassing given Debbie's suspended membership status. Debbie's composure finally, completely shattered, sobbing openly now, insisting repeatedly that she'd only ever wanted to protect her community from people like us. I stood quietly through it all. Zoe finally emerging from the pool, dripping, confused, asking why police cars sat in the parking lot. I hugged her tightly, told her everything was fine now, that Mommy had simply stood up for herself the way I'd always taught her to, no matter how scared it felt. The video, inevitably, exploded across social media within hours, this time reaching genuinely national attention. News outlets picked up the story by evening, headlines echoing almost exactly the confrontation everyone had witnessed. An HOA figure directing an unauthorized security guard to physically remove a black homeowner, who calmly, firmly, refused to move. Debbie was arrested that same evening, charged with assault and criminal trespassing given her suspended status, while Gary faced separate assault charges of his own for the physical grab captured unmistakably on multiple angles of video. Neither would spend the night in their own beds. Both spent it instead in custody. I didn't celebrate, exactly, watching the news coverage that night with Marcus and Zoe finally asleep upstairs. I felt something quieter, heavier, more complicated than victory, relief. Mostly, that after nearly a year of careful documentation, patient strategy, and quiet endurance, the truth had finally, undeniably, become impossible to ignore. My colleague called late that night, professionally thrilled, personally relieved, confirming the fair housing complaint I'd filed weeks earlier now carried overwhelming additional evidentiary weight given the criminal charges, the viral footage, and the mounting financial fraud findings already under separate investigation by the state ombudsman's office entirely. Debbie Holt, once untouchable within her own carefully constructed kingdom, now faced criminal charges, a collapsing marriage, a financial fraud investigation, a discrimination lawsuit, and a viral video watched by millions showing exactly who she'd truly been all along. Underneath 9 years of clipboards, smiles, and carefully rationed cruelty. Debbie posted bail the following morning. Released pending trial. Her mugshot already circulating widely online alongside think pieces about HOA overreach and community power abuse. Richard finalized their divorce filing that same week, requesting immediate removal of his name from any properties or accounts connected to the unfolding financial investigation. I gave a formal statement to detectives investigating the embezzlement, providing every document I'd gathered across nearly a year, bank records, consulting invoices, patrol logs, witness testimonies. The lead detective told me afterward it was among the most thoroughly documented civilian complaints she'd encountered in 15 years on the force. The state ombudsman's final financial report arrived 2 weeks later, confirming over $93,000 in misappropriated HOA funds across 3 years, funneled through Wexler Holt Consulting and 2 additional shell arrangements investigators uncovered during their expanded review, including one connected to Willowbrook's landscaping contract awarded to Debbie's brother-in-law, Arthur, now officially elected president following an uncontested special election, publicly committed to full financial transparency going forward. publishing quarterly budget reports and instituting competitive bidding requirements for all future vendor contracts. Willowbrook, slowly, painfully, began rebuilding trust its previous leadership had spent nearly a decade systematically destroying. More former residents came forward once the news coverage spread, including the young Latino couple Carol had mentioned months earlier, now willing to speak publicly about fines, harassment, and eventual pressured departure from Willowbrook nearly 3 years prior. Their testimony strengthened both the criminal case and my civil discrimination complaint considerably. I sat for a deposition regarding the fair housing complaint. For hours of detailed questioning from Debbie's civil attorney attempting, unsuccessfully, to poke holes in documentation that had simply been too thorough, too consistent, too carefully preserved across nearly a full year of patient, deliberate, professional record-keeping. Debbie's criminal attorney, meanwhile, reportedly advised her to accept a plea deal given the overwhelming video evidence and witness testimony, an option she initially refused, still insisting publicly, through occasional erratic social media posts on new accounts, that she'd been victimized by a coordinated smear campaign against her leadership. The financial fraud charges complicated any potential plea significantly. Prosecutors now pursuing felony embezzlement alongside the assault and trespassing charges from the pool incident, facing a combined case strong enough that even Debbie's own attorney reportedly grew visibly frustrated with her continued public statements undermining their defense strategy. Gary Wexler, separately, accepted a plea deal quickly, pleading guilty to misdemeanor assault in exchange for cooperation testimony against Debbie regarding the consulting arrangement and the pattern of targeted, unauthorized patrols he'd conducted at her direct, repeated, personal instruction throughout his entire employment with Redline Patrol. His cooperation proved devastating for Debbie's case, confirming under oath that she'd specifically instructed him to focus patrols on our address without legitimate complaints, that she'd personally arranged his hiring through the consulting shell company, and that she'd directed him explicitly to confront me physically at the community pool. The community, meanwhile, continued its quiet transformation. Carol organized a proper welcome event for our family, nearly a year overdue, complete with the casserole dishes and genuine warmth we should have received the very first week we'd moved in, before Debbie's clipboard and calculated cruelty had poisoned everything that followed. Zoe made real friends finally, invited to sleepovers, birthday parties, the ordinary childhood milestones that fear and tension had quietly stolen from her for nearly a year. Watching her laugh freely again, unguarded, reminded me precisely why I'd fought this battle so relentlessly, despite every exhausting, frightening moment along the way. My firm, impressed by how I'd handled the entire ordeal professionally despite the personal stakes involved, asked me to formally lead a new practice group focused specifically on HOA discrimination and community association fraud cases, recognizing the pattern I'd uncovered likely existed, undocumented, in communities across the entire region. I accepted, understanding this fight had become larger than just my own family's experience. 3 additional families from neighboring associations reached out within weeks of the news coverage, describing eerily similar patterns of selective enforcement and unaccountable leadership, confirming what I'd suspected all along. Willowbrook wasn't unique. It was simply exposed. The civil discrimination lawsuit moved toward trial. Debbie's attorney unable to secure a settlement given how thoroughly documented and publicly corroborated the pattern of discriminatory enforcement had become. Depositions from 9 current and former residents. Financial records. Video footage. And Gary's cooperating testimony created a case difficult to meaningfully contest. Debbie's remaining public support finally evaporated entirely once local news published Gary's full deposition testimony, detailing specifically how the consulting payments worked, how patrol targets were selected, and how Debbie had explicitly referenced our family's race in private conversations he'd witnessed, comments she'd always carefully avoided saying anywhere recorded before. That specific testimony, more than any financial document or video clip, finally eliminated any remaining ambiguity about her true motivations. This had never genuinely been about mailboxes, trampolines, or holiday decorations. It had always, from the very first uncomfortable welcome, been about a woman deciding my family didn't belong somewhere we'd rightfully earned. I felt something shift in myself reading that testimony. A year of careful professional restraint finally giving way to something rawer, more honest. I'd spent months telling myself this was simply a legal case, methodically building evidence. Reading Gary's words, I finally let myself feel the full weight of what we'd survived. Marcus found me crying quietly in the kitchen that evening. The first time I'd genuinely broken down since the false CPS report months earlier. He held me without saying much, understanding instinctively that some wounds needed acknowledgement more than solutions, that strength sometimes simply meant finally allowing yourself to feel something fully. The criminal trial date arrived in late spring, nearly 14 months after we'd first moved into Willowbrook, expecting nothing more complicated than a quiet, comfortable home for our daughter. Debbie, facing combined charges of felony embezzlement, assault, and criminal trespassing, finally accepted a plea deal 3 days before proceedings were set to begin. Her plea included a full admission of guilt on the financial fraud charges and the assault charge from the pool confrontation, in exchange for reduced sentencing recommendations. Prosecutors, satisfied with the outcome given the strength of evidence, agreed, understanding a guaranteed conviction outweighed the uncertainty and expense of a lengthy public trial. I attended the plea hearing, sitting quietly in the gallery beside Marcus and Carol, watching Debbie Holt stand before a judge and formally admit, on record, to embezzling nearly $100,000 from her own community and to assaulting a homeowner she'd targeted specifically because of the color of her skin. The judge, reviewing sentencing recommendations, noted explicitly the aggravating factor of racial motivation documented throughout the case, a detail that would carry weight in the eventual sentencing hearing scheduled for several weeks later, alongside restitution requirements for the misappropriated HOA funds Debbie now formally, legally, owed her former community. Gary Wexler received his own sentencing separately, a suspended sentence given his cooperation, mandatory community service, and a permanent restriction from private security employment anywhere within the state. A professional consequence matching the pattern investigators eventually confirmed had followed him since his original, quietly resolved police department resignation years earlier. Willowbrook's board, meanwhile, finalized new governance policies preventing any single officer from unilaterally directing security services, requiring board-wide approval for vendor contracts, and establishing an independent grievance process for future fining disputes. Structural changes designed specifically to prevent another Debbie Holt from ever consolidating that much unchecked power again. Arthur asked if I'd considered joining the board formally, given everything I'd contributed toward finally exposing years of misconduct. I declined gently, explaining I needed distance from Willowbrook's governance entirely, though I promised to remain engaged as an ordinary resident. Finally, simply, enjoying the home we'd worked so hard to keep. The civil discrimination lawsuit settled shortly after the criminal plea. Willowbrook's insurance carrier and Debbie personally agreeing to a substantial settlement covering damages, legal fees, and a formal, public, written apology acknowledging the documented pattern of discriminatory enforcement targeting minority families throughout her 9-year tenure as association president. I donated a portion of the settlement toward establishing a legal fund helping HOA residents in similar disputes access proper documentation and representation, understanding firsthand how isolating and expensive fighting unaccountable community leadership could become without resources, without knowledge, without someone willing to patiently, methodically, refuse to simply disappear quietly. The investigative journalist who'd first covered our story published a longer feature piece following the settlement, tracing the entire arc from Debbie's initial welcome basket to her eventual guilty plea, calling it a case study in how ordinary community governance can quietly become a vehicle for extraordinary, sustained discrimination. Sentencing day arrived on a bright Tuesday morning in June, exactly 14 months since Debbie Holt had first handed us that thick binder of community standards with a smile that hadn't reached her eyes. I sat in the courtroom gallery, Marcus beside me, ready finally to watch this entire chapter reach its true, undeniable conclusion. The courtroom filled steadily that morning. More Willowbrook residents present than I'd expected. Carol, Arthur, the Nguyen family driving 40 minutes, just to witness the conclusion of a story that had, in many ways, started long before we'd ever arrived. With families Debbie had targeted years before us. The prosecutor opened with a summary of the case, embezzlement totals, the assault charge, and the aggravating racial motivation documented through Gary's testimony and Debbie's own private communications, subpoenaed during the investigation, revealing explicit language about keeping Willowbrook's character that left little room for any innocent interpretation whatsoever. Debbie's attorney requested leniency, citing her otherwise unblemished community service record and lack of prior criminal history, framing her actions as an isolated lapse in judgment under significant personal stress. I felt Marcus's hand tighten around mine, both of us recognizing the absurdity of calling 9 years a lapse. Then, unexpectedly, the prosecutor introduced new information neither Marcus nor I had known. Records showing Debbie had served on a homeowners association board in South Carolina 15 years earlier, resigning abruptly amid an unresolved discrimination complaint filed by a Korean-American family, sealed at the time, only recently uncovered. The revelation rippled through the courtroom audibly. This wasn't Debbie's first pattern of targeted discrimination disguised as community governance. It was, devastatingly, at least her second documented instance, separated by over a decade and several states, suggesting something far more deliberate than the isolated lapse her attorney had just described. The judge asked Debbie's attorney directly whether the defense had been aware of this prior history. He admitted, visibly uncomfortable, that he had not, glancing toward Debbie with an expression suggesting his client had concealed relevant information from her own legal counsel throughout their entire working relationship together. Debbie, called to allocution, stood shakily, delivering a statement that began with practiced remorse before slowly devolving into familiar justifications, claiming she'd always cared deeply about community standards, that misunderstandings had been exaggerated by media coverage, that she'd never intentionally targeted anyone based on race or background whatsoever. The judge interrupted her directly, reading aloud from her own subpoenaed text messages to Gary, messages explicitly discussing that family and people who don't fit here, messages sent months before any legitimate complaint against us existed. Debbie's justification collapsed mid-sentence. She had no response ready for her own recorded words. I was called to deliver my victim impact statement next. Standing slowly, feeling the weight of 14 months settle into my chest as I approached the podium. I looked directly at Debbie, who avoided my eyes entirely, staring instead at some fixed point on the courtroom floor beneath her feet. I moved to Willowbrook expecting a quiet home for my daughter. I began, voice steady despite everything churning underneath it. Instead, I spent nearly 14 months documenting harassment, fighting false accusations, and protecting my family from a woman who decided, before we'd even unpacked, that we didn't belong there. I described the false CPS report specifically, watching several jurors and gallery members visibly react, describing the terror of a caseworker walking through my home evaluating my daughter's safety based entirely on lies. That's not neighborhood politics, I said.
That's using a child protective system.
I spoke about Zoe's changed behavior, her withdrawn quietness, her drawings shifting from bright suns to gray skies during the worst months, a 7-year-old absorbing tension she couldn't fully articulate but felt completely, viscerally. Every single day she lived under the shadow of someone else's unchecked, weaponized authority. I addressed the financial fraud too, noting that every fine, every targeted patrol, every consulting dollar diverted toward her own family had come directly from HOA dues paid faithfully by neighbors who trusted her leadership completely. She didn't just target us, I said.
She stole from every...
I closed by acknowledging something I hadn't planned to say aloud, that I understood, professionally, how rarely cases like this reached genuine accountability. How many families simply left quietly rather than fight. How privilege and resources had allowed me to document what others couldn't. This isn't just my victory, I said. It's theirs too. I returned to my seat, Marcus squeezing my hand tightly, Carol wiping tears openly 2 rows back. The Nguyen family's eldest daughter, now a young woman, stood next, delivering her own statement about her family's quiet departure years earlier, confirming publicly, finally, what Debbie's pattern had cost them long before us. Her statement described selling their home at a significant loss, her parents' English still developing at the time, unable to navigate the association's deliberately confusing appeals process, simply choosing to leave rather than continue fighting a system stacked entirely against them from the very beginning of their tenure there. Debbie's face remained impassive through most of it, though I noticed her hands trembling slightly against the defense table, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her since the courtroom proceedings began that morning. More human somehow than any of her earlier practiced performative statements of remorse. The prosecutor closed with sentencing recommendations reflecting the aggravating factors: documented racial motivation, financial exploitation of vulnerable homeowners, prior undisclosed pattern in South Carolina, and the use of a false child welfare report as retaliation, recommending the maximum available sentence under Georgia's applicable statutes for the combined charges. Defense counsel made one final attempt, requesting probation and community service instead of incarceration, citing Debbie's capacity for rehabilitation and age as mitigating factors. The judge listened without visible reaction, reviewing documents silently for several long minutes while the entire courtroom sat in tense, uncertain, collective anticipation.
The judge finally began, voice measured but unmistakably firm. What troubles this court most isn't simply the financial fraud, though $93,000 is substantial. It's the deliberate, calculated weaponization of institutional authority against families who trusted you, repeated across states, repeated across years, repeated without any apparent remorse.
The judge continued, addressing the false CPS report specifically as an act of profound cruelty exceeding even the financial charges in its potential for lasting harm, noting that Georgia law treats such reports with particular seriousness precisely because they exploit systems designed to protect children for purposes of personal retaliation instead. This court finds no genuine indication of rehabilitation, the judge stated plainly. Only a pattern of behavior spanning over a decade, concealed from your own attorney, denied publicly until evidence made denial impossible, and justified even now through language minimizing serious criminal conduct as mere misunderstanding or overreaction. Debbie's composure finally broke entirely, sobbing openly at the defense table as the judge continued reading through the formal findings, cataloging each charge methodically: felony embezzlement, aggravated assault, criminal trespassing, with sentencing enhancements reflecting both the racial motivation and the previously undisclosed pattern from her South Carolina tenure. I watched her cry, feeling something complicated stir in my chest. Not satisfaction exactly, not quite sympathy either, but something closer to recognition that a person capable of causing this much sustained harm to so many families had likely, somewhere along the way, become genuinely incapable of seeing herself clearly. The court sentences you, the judge announced finally, to 7 years incarceration on the combined charges, with eligibility for parole review after 4 years contingent on completed restitution. Payments totaling $93,000 to Willowbrook's Homeowners Association, along with mandatory participation in anti-bias education programming throughout your incarceration period. The judge added a permanent injunction barring Debbie from ever holding any homeowners association leadership position anywhere within the state of Georgia. A specific, deliberate provision the prosecutor had requested precisely to prevent any possibility of the pattern repeating itself a third time in some future community unaware of her history. Gasps rippled through the gallery at the sentence length, longer than many had anticipated given the initial plea negotiations. Debbie's attorney requested a moment with his client, granted briefly, though nothing seemed capable of steadying her now as bailiffs approached, preparing to escort her from the courtroom into custody immediately. She turned once, briefly, toward the gallery before being led away, her eyes finally finding mine directly for the first time since the proceedings had begun that morning. I held her gaze steadily, offering neither cruelty nor forgiveness, simply the unwavering presence of someone who had refused, completely, to disappear. "This isn't over," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else, as bailiffs guided her toward the side door. I didn't respond. That 14 months of documentation, testimony, and consequence hadn't already, thoroughly, undeniably, permanently said on my behalf instead. The courtroom slowly emptied afterward, Carol hugging me tightly, the Nguyen family's mother taking my hands in both of hers, tears streaming freely, thanking me in careful English for finally giving their families quiet suffering a public voice years after they'd stopped believing anyone would ever truly listen. Arthur approached too, shaking Marcus's hand firmly, promising Willowbrook's rebuilding would continue steadily under transparent, accountable leadership from now forward. "You didn't just win your own case," he said to me quietly. "You fixed something broken long before you ever arrived. Something none of us had the courage to fix ourselves." I stepped outside the courthouse into bright June sunlight, Marcus's arm around my shoulders, feeling something settle inside me that had been unsettled since that very first uncomfortable welcome 14 months earlier. Not simple happiness exactly, but something steadier, more permanent, closer to genuine peace finally. Fully earned. Reporters gathered outside, requesting statements. I offered a brief one, deliberately measured. This case was never really about me. It was about accountability finally reaching a system that had operated without any for far too long. I hope other families watching this find the courage to document, to persist, to refuse silence. The story led local news that evening, then spread nationally the following day, becoming a frequently cited example in broader conversations about HOA reform, prompting several state legislators to announce proposed bills strengthening transparency requirements and creating clearer accountability mechanisms for homeowners associations statewide, inspired directly by Willowbrook's documented failures. Richard, Debbie's now ex-husband, sent me a brief message that week, apologizing again, more genuinely this time, admitting he'd suspected far more than he'd ever confronted directly, choosing comfortable ignorance over difficult honesty for years longer than he now clearly wished he had chosen differently, more courageously, sooner. I didn't respond extensively, simply acknowledging his message, understanding that whatever guilt he carried was ultimately his own to process, separate from whatever accountability. Debbie herself now faced entirely alone, stripped finally of every position, every relationship, every carefully constructed pretense that had sustained her authority for nearly a decade. Gary Wexler, completing his community service sentence, reached out once too, an awkward, halting apology delivered through a mutual acquaintance rather than directly, expressing regret for getting caught up in family loyalty without fully reckoning with the racial dimension of what he'd actually participated in for months. I appreciated the gesture, cautiously, while recognizing its limitations. Genuine accountability required more than regret over consequences. It required honest reckoning with harm caused, something Gary's message gestured toward without quite fully reaching. Still, it was more than Debbie herself had ever offered, even facing 7 years in prison. Willowbrook itself continued its quiet transformation through that summer. Arthur's transparent leadership drawing genuine community trust for the first time in years. New families welcomed warmly regardless of background. The clubhouse hosting potlucks and gatherings that felt, finally, like the neighborhood we'd originally hoped to find when we first moved in. Zoe's 8th birthday party that August drew nearly 20 children from across the neighborhood. Genuine friends rather than cautious acquaintances. The backyard filled with laughter and water balloons and the ordinary, unremarkable joy of childhood that fear had quietly stolen from her for far too long before finally, fully, returning. I watched her running across our lawn that afternoon, completely unguarded, completely herself, and felt the last remaining tension I'd been carrying for over a year finally, genuinely release. This was what we'd fought for. Ultimately, not vindication exactly, though that mattered too, but simply this, her freedom to just be a child. My firm's new practice group, meanwhile, grew quickly, taking on 3 additional HOA discrimination cases within its first 2 months, each one drawing directly on documentation, strategies I'd developed through my own experience, transforming what had once been private, isolated suffering into a genuine, replicable framework for accountability elsewhere. I spoke at a state housing policy conference that fall, sharing our story alongside policy recommendations for strengthening HOA oversight, watching attendees take careful notes, understanding that whatever pain this year had cost us, something genuinely useful, genuinely protective for other families, had grown directly from documenting it so thoroughly throughout. Debbie's restitution payments began arriving slowly through the state's structured process. Willowbrook's rebuilt board using the recovered funds to establish a genuine community reserve, properly audited, transparently reported, the exact opposite of everything her tenure had represented for nearly a decade of unchecked, unaccountable, self-serving leadership. Carol and I grew genuinely close that year, weekly dinners becoming a steady tradition, her stories about Willowbrook's earlier, warmer history helping me understand this community hadn't always been broken, simply captured, temporarily, by someone who'd exploited every structural weakness available to consolidate power nobody had thought to properly limit. Marcus, watching our family finally settle into genuine peace, admitted one evening how frightened he'd been throughout the entire ordeal, not of Debbie specifically, but of losing me to the exhaustion of constant vigilance, constant documentation, constant careful strategy. I told him honestly it had frightened me too, every single day. But you never once suggested we just leave, he said. I explained what I'd known instinctively from the very beginning. Leaving wouldn't have stopped Debbie, only shifted her attention toward whoever moved into our house next, continuing a pattern that had already, demonstrably, claimed multiple families before us across many years, staying, documenting, fighting through proper legal channels rather than simply fleeing quietly. That had been the only path capable of actually stopping the pattern entirely, protecting not just our own family, but every family who might have eventually moved into Willowbrook unaware of the danger waiting patiently within its gates. I received a letter from the young Latino couple who'd left years earlier, now living happily in a different community, thanking me for finally giving their experience public validation, mentioning they'd considered moving back to the Atlanta area now that Willowbrook's leadership had genuinely, verifiably changed for the better. The investigative journalist who'd covered our story won a regional award for the reporting that fall, crediting our documentation as essential to the piece's depth and credibility, inviting me to a small celebration where I met several other reporters covering similar accountability stories across different states entirely. I began, slowly, cautiously, sharing our story more publicly through occasional speaking engagements, always centering the practical lessons, documentation, patience, proper legal channels, community coalition building, rather than dwelling excessively on the trauma itself, wanting other families to walk away equipped rather than simply moved emotionally by our experience. Zoe, now settled comfortably into her second year at Willowbrook Elementary, occasionally asked questions about the mean lady who used to live near us. Questions I answered honestly but carefully, explaining that sometimes people with power misused it badly, and that standing up calmly, truthfully, mattered enormously when that happened. "Did you win?" she asked once, direct in the way only children manage to be. I told her the truth, that winning wasn't quite the right word, that what actually happened was accountability. Finally, reaching someone who'd avoided it for far too long, protecting not just our family but many others in the process. Marcus and I hosted our own barbecue that October. The family reunion gathering Debbie had once tried to prevent through her community character clause, finally happening freely, joyfully, nearly 40 guests filling our backyard with music, laughter, and food. Exactly the ordinary neighborhood life we'd originally hoped Willowbrook would offer us. Arthur stopped by briefly, along with several board members, genuinely welcomed now rather than merely tolerated, sharing updates about the community's continued transparent governance. New bylaws preventing any single officer from controlling security decisions unilaterally. Structural safeguards born directly from everything our family had endured to expose them. I watched Zoe running through the yard with her friends that afternoon, Marcus laughing beside our new neighbors, Carol proudly showing off a pie recipe to anyone who'd listen, and felt, finally, completely, that we'd built exactly the life we'd originally moved to Willowbrook hoping to find. Delayed but not denied. Debbie remained incarcerated, her restitution payments continuing steadily, her parole eligibility still years away, her name occasionally resurfacing in HOA reform discussions as a cautionary example cited in policy debates across multiple states now considering similar transparency legislation inspired partly by everything our documented case had ultimately exposed. I thought about her occasionally, not with lingering anger exactly, but with the particular clarity that comes from finally understanding someone completely, her need for control, her cruelty toward anyone who threatened it, her genuine belief, perhaps, that she'd simply been protecting something rather than destroying multiple families' peace repeatedly. That understanding didn't translate into forgiveness. Not entirely, not yet, but it did allow me something more valuable, genuine closure, the ability to walk through my own neighborhood without vigilance, to let Zoe play freely without documenting every interaction, to simply, finally, live in the home we'd fought so hard to keep. My legal practice group's docket continued growing that winter, each new case reinforcing what I'd learned firsthand. That accountability, however slow, however exhausting to pursue, remained genuinely possible when families refused silence, documented thoroughly, and found allies willing to speak truthfully once someone else demonstrated the courage to speak first. Carol's granddaughter, visiting for the holidays, asked me directly what advice I'd give someone facing a similar situation elsewhere. I told her simply, document everything, trust your instincts about patterns even before you can fully prove them, find your Carols and your Arthurs, and never, ever, let anyone convince you that standing firm makes you the problem. The new year arrived quietly, gratefully, our second in Willowbrook feeling entirely different from the first, genuine community, genuine peace, genuine belonging finally achieved not through Debbie Holt's narrow, exclusionary vision, but through its complete, thorough, well-documented rejection by nearly everyone who'd once been too frightened to challenge it directly. I received one final piece of correspondence that January, forwarded through the State Corrections Department. A letter from Debbie herself, the first direct communication since her sentencing. I hesitated before opening it, uncertain what to expect after everything that had unfolded across nearly 2 full years of conflict between us. The letter was brief, oddly formal, expressing what she called regret for how things escalated while still, remarkably, avoiding any direct acknowledgement of racial motivation, still framing herself as someone who'd simply cared too much about community standards that had somehow, mysteriously, spiraled beyond her control entirely. I read it twice, feeling less anger than I'd expected, mostly a quiet, settled recognition that some people simply never fully reckon with the harm they've caused. That closure sometimes arrives not through someone else's genuine apology, but through your own decision to stop waiting for one that may never truly come. I didn't respond to the letter. Some conversations I'd learned across this entire ordeal didn't require completion to reach genuine resolution. I filed it away, quietly, alongside everything else, and returned to the life we'd built, deliberately, carefully, on the foundation of everything we'd survived together as a family. Marcus found me that evening, staring at Zoe's latest drawing taped to our refrigerator, our house. Bright yellow sun overhead. 3 stick figures holding hands in the front yard. Unmistakably happy. "She drew us again," he said softly. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment, simply grateful, simply present. 2 years after that first uncomfortable welcome, Willowbrook felt genuinely, finally, like home, not because everything painful had been erased, but because we'd faced it directly, documented it thoroughly, and emerged with something Debbie Holt had never managed to take from us despite every calculated effort across 14 relentless months. I still keep the original complaint file, thick with documentation, tucked in my home office as a physical reminder of exactly what patient, methodical persistence can accomplish against unaccountable power, however entrenched, however protected, however confident it once was that families like mine would simply disappear quietly rather than fight back. Other families, inspired by our story, began organizing more actively within their own communities, forming informal networks sharing documentation strategies, legal resources, and simple solidarity, understanding collectively what I'd learned individually. That isolation was always Debbie Holt's greatest weapon. And community, genuine community, remained the most effective answer against it. Willowbrook today operates under bylaws explicitly prohibiting the exact abuses that once defined its darkest chapter: unilateral security deployment, unaudited vendor contracts, discretionary fining, without transparent appeal processes, safeguards written directly, deliberately, permanently into its governing documents because one family refused to leave quietly when everything demanded that we should. 3 years later, I still drive past the old clubhouse sometimes, now renamed the Willowbrook Community Center, hosting cultural celebrations Debbie would never have approved, welcoming families from backgrounds she'd once quietly, systematically worked to exclude from the community she'd claimed to be protecting throughout her entire troubled tenure. Zoe, now 10, occasionally mentions the story to new friends with a strange, matter-of-fact pride, describing her mother as the lawyer who stood up to the mean HOA lady. A simplified version of events that nonetheless captures something essentially true about persistence, courage, and refusing to accept unfair treatment quietly. Arthur still leads the board, transparent and accountable, occasionally consulting me informally on governance questions. Willowbrook now frequently cited in regional housing policy discussions as an example of genuine community reform following documented crisis. Proof that broken systems could actually heal when finally, thoroughly, held accountable. My practice group has since helped over 30 families document and resolve similar HOA discrimination cases across Georgia, each one building on lessons learned from our own experience, transforming isolated suffering into collective knowledge, individual documentation into systemic accountability nobody could have imagined possible during those darkest early months. Debbie remains incarcerated, her parole hearing still pending review, her restitution payments continuing steadily toward the community she once exploited so thoroughly. I don't know what she'll do when eventually released, whether genuine reckoning will ever arrive, whether the pattern spanning multiple states across multiple decades will finally, truly end. What I know for certain is this: our family stayed, documented, fought, and ultimately transformed not just our own circumstances, but an entire community's future, proving that quiet persistence, patient evidence, and the simple refusal to disappear quietly could dismantle even the most entrenched, unaccountable abuse of power eventually. I think back often to that first Saturday. Fireflies dancing across our new lawn, Marcus's hand in mine, believing simply that we'd found our fresh start. We had, though not in the way either of us expected, not merely a house, but a hard-won understanding of what genuine community actually requires. It requires courage from ordinary people, patience through exhausting uncertainty, and the willingness to document truth even when believing anyone will listen feels impossibly difficult. It requires refusing the comfortable silence that lets abuse of power continue unchecked. Year after year, family after family, until someone finally says enough. Debbie Holt believed, for 9 confident years, that her authority was unshakable, that families like mine would simply leave quietly rather than fight. She was wrong, completely, devastatingly wrong, and that miscalculation ultimately cost her everything she'd spent decades carefully, cruelly building across multiple states and countless unsuspecting families. Our home in Willowbrook remains exactly what we originally hoped it would be: imperfect, ordinary, genuinely ours, filled with Zoe's laughter, Marcus's steady presence, and the quiet, hard-earned peace of a family who stood their ground completely when everything around them insisted that we should simply disappear instead. I stood my ground that day at the pool, hand gripped tight, refusing to move, refusing to be erased from a community I'd rightfully earned. Debbie Holt learned, far too late, exactly who she'd underestimated. We were never leaving. Fight. The END.